Hey gang, it's your buddy Platt here with another Spirit Series video. Today we're going to talk about bourbon. Bourbon basically is an American-made corn-based whiskey that is aged in barrels. The name bourbon itself supposedly comes from the French Bourbon dynasty that also expanded into Spain and Luxembourg around anywhere from the late 1200s to about the 1700s. There are also some hypothesize that the name Bourbon comes from Bourbon County in Kentucky, which most likely came from the Bourbon dynasty. And also some people hypothesize that it's named after Bourbon Street in New Orleans. New Orleans was a big part of bourbon because the barrels would come down from Kentucky down the river to New Orleans, where they would get shipped throughout the world, the marketplace of the world. No one's 100% sure. So it's kind of fun to speculate there. Bourbon, one of the questions I get is, can bourbon just be made in Kentucky, or is Kentucky the only place? Bourbon can be made anywhere in the U.S. Now, currently 95% of bourbon comes from Kentucky, and it wasn't that long ago it was 100%, but some distillers across the country now are starting to play around. I know there's some Texas bourbons. I want to say the distillery here in Las Vegas has produced a bourbon. I don't know if it's still currently being sold, but I know they played around with that. I got a feeling in future years that number is going to drop a little bit. More and more places are going to try their hand at bourbon because they can still get access to corn anywhere. Many believe that it was a Baptist minister, Elijah Craig, that first produced what we think of as bourbon today. Depending on what part of Kentucky you're from, some will also say that it was a gentleman named Jacob Spears. Not many people know who Jacob Spears are, but Elijah Craig still has his name on a bottle of bourbon today, so probably most people will side with Elijah Craig on this. Again, that's another one we're just not 100% sure about. As far as who brought distilling to the area, it was the Scotch, the Scotch-Irish, the Welsh that came over, brought their knowledge of whiskey making over to here. And what they had available here that they didn't back home was corn. Back home they were distilling barley. Here they had access to barley and other things, but they also had access to corn. And thus that kind of helps bring about bourbon. Bourbon, as we think of it today in the very modern sense, was kind of solidified in 1964 when Congress made bourbon the American spirit. They also set up a set of rules for production and labeling of bourbon. There's 6 main rules. First, has to be made in the USA. Second, has to be made of at least 51% corn in the mash bill. 3, has to be aged in new oak. And the term they use is containers, but generally we think of barrels. Most of the time it is white oak barrels, but I think in the legislation it's just new oak barrels. It can't be distilled at higher than 160 proof. We talked about neutral grain spirits, how those column stills would get into the low 190s or whatever and kind of strip out the flavor. Well, bourbon's regulated. We want to keep some of that flavor, so they keep the proof down to 160 proof on the distilling. It cannot go in that barrel, that new oak barrel, at more than 125 proof, and it cannot be put in a bottle to sell at less than 80 proof. Those are the 6 main rules. If you see an age statement on bourbon, that age is the youngest bourbon that goes into that bottle, barrel blend. What happens a lot of times in a bourbon distillery is they'll do a batch to bottle, and it may be 6, 8, 10 barrels, what have you. And if that label says 6 year, that's the youngest in there, but there may be 7 or 8 year old bourbon in there, and that's because that barrel may have been in a part of the warehouse that just didn't get enough heat, what have you, and just the whiskey did not age fast enough in that barrel to hit a certain taste point. So like I said, you may have some older whiskeys in there, but whatever that youngest one is, that's what the label says. unaged bourbon, or bourbon that is coming off the still and getting ready to go in the barrel, is referred to as White Dog. There are some companies out there now that are starting to sell White Dog. If you've never tried it, it is different than what you think of bourbon. The barrel plays a real big part in the flavor, and you take that out, and it's a quite different product. You get a little more of a grainy. You almost drink it. You could really almost taste the corn in the White Dog. But it may be something you might want to try. The particular bourbon we're going to try today is the classic American bourbon, the #1 selling bourbon in the world, and that is Jim Beam Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, 80 proof, 40% alcohol by volume. The Beam family has been involved the whole time in the process. There's been, if you've seen the bigger balls of Jim Beam, they'll have the 7 generations of the family that first created Jim Beam have ran the company or been the master distillers ever since. Today, the family no longer directly owns the company. It's owned by Suntory out of Japan. But a gentleman named Fred No, who is the 7th generation, is kind of still the face of the company, represents it. I personally say I've had Jim Beam with 2 generations of the family. I've had Beam a couple different times with Fred. And then, unfortunately, about 16, 17 years ago, I was able to meet his father, Booker, and actually had some Knob Creek with him. So I have a kind of personal interaction with the family. So let's give the Beam family's bourbon a try. Ooh, get a little bit of that rye. There's almost a little burn in the nose. I can pick up some of that rye. As far as bourbon goes, the other grains that are generally in there are either wheat, barley, or rye. Wheat tends to produce a softer whiskey. Rye produces a little more bite. Barley's a little more neutral than the other two. Oh man, that is good stuff. Man, I haven't had that in a while. I haven't had Jim Beam in a while. Really nice. Goes down smooth. A little of the sweet punch up front. Jim Beam to me seems balanced. It's not soft like a Maker's Mark, which I'm not necessarily saying is a bad thing. I get a little of the pepper on the side, but it's not aggressive. But it lets you know it's there. Just a good, solid bourbon. I get some of the caramel, some of the vanilla notes. Man, this just, it's not a 20-year. This is not a $75 bottle or whatever, but it's just a good bourbon. Got a little bit of a kick, got a little sweetness. Just, this is what you think of when you have bourbon. Well, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe down below. Also, please like the video because it lets YouTube know we're putting out good content. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comment section, or you can always contact me on the Twitter page. Till next time, bottoms up.